Slovenia left in 10 days. Bosnia burned for years. The same breakup did not hit every part of Yugoslavia the same way. So how did one country disappear, and why did its collapse turn into war? That contrast tells you something important right away. Yugoslavia did not vanish because its people suddenly remembered ancient hatreds. The missing context is that a real country lost the machinery that kept sovereignty shared. And once that machinery broke down, the hardest question was no longer whether Yugoslavia could survive. It was who had the right to leave, who controlled the army, which borders counted, and what would happen to people living on the wrong side of a new state. To understand that, start with something many viewers barely remember. Yugoslavia was a real country. It had a passport, an army, a federal government, a place in the Cold War that was neither fully East nor fully West. For decades, it looked like one of the more unusual success stories in Europe. After the Second World War, socialist Yugoslavia was built as a federation of 6 republics: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia. Inside Serbia, there were also 2 autonomous provinces, Kosovo and Vojvodina. At the center of the system stood Josip Broz Tito, the communist leader who helped hold the state together after the war. His Yugoslavia presented itself as a country of brotherhood and unity. That did not mean national questions disappeared. Serbs, Croats, Slovens, Bosnian Muslims, today generally called Bosniaks, Macedonians, Montenegrins, Albanians, and others, did not suddenly stop being who they were. It meant the state found a way to manage those differences. Communist rule limited open political competition. Federal institutions distributed power. And Tito himself acted as a kind of political center of gravity. This is crucial. Yugoslavia was not held together because everyone finally agreed on one nation, one identity, and one permanent answer to sovereignty. It was held together because the system managed disagreement. That is not the same thing as solving it. In 1974, the Constitution pushed power further outward. The republics gained more leverage. So did Kosovo and Vojvodina inside Serbia. That helped address some complaints about central domination. But it also meant the state depended even more on political balance, compromise, and a functioning federal center. Then Tito died in 1980. And after that, the system had to run without the person who had spent decades holding its contradictions together. At the same time, the economy was getting worse. Debt rose, inflation rose, unemployment and frustration spread. Different republics experienced the crisis differently, and that made federal solidarity harder to maintain. When money is tight and trust is falling, constitutional arguments stop feeling abstract. They become arguments about who is paying, who is blocked, and who is being used by whom. By the late 1980s, the old Yugoslav formula was weakening from several directions at once. The economy was unstable. The Common Communist Party was losing its authority. And political leaders were increasingly willing to use national grievance as a way to build support. One of the most important turning points came in Serbia and Kosovo. Kosovo had an Albanian majority and significant autonomy inside socialist Yugoslavia. For many Serbs, that autonomy had gone too far and symbolized Serbia's weakness inside the federation. For many Kosovo Albanians, autonomy was the minimum protection against Serbian domination. When Serbia sharply curtailed Kosovo's autonomy beginning in 1989, it did not just change one province, it changed the balance of the federation. And it deepened the sense, especially outside Serbia, that the question was no longer only how Yugoslavia should be reformed. It was whether the whole federal structure could still be trusted at all. Then another pillar cracked. The League of Communists of Yugoslavia, one of the main institutions that had held the country together, effectively broke apart in 1990. Once the common ruling party stopped functioning as a real center, Republican politics became decisive. That is when the breakup stopped being theoretical. Multi-party elections gave new leaders democratic mandates inside republics. But those mandates did not answer the biggest question. Were the republics sovereign political units with the right to leave? Or was Yugoslavia a common state whose borders and armed forces could not be broken up unilaterally? That is the constitutional argument underneath the wars. And it is one reason simplistic explanations fail. This was not just a spontaneous explosion of neighbor against neighbor. It was also a fight over institutions, law, legitimacy, and force. Now look at how unevenly the breakup unfolded. Slovenia is the cleanest example of why one explanation cannot cover everything. It declared independence in June 1991. There was fighting, but the 10-day war was short. Slovenia was less demographically entangled than some other republics, and it was less central to the territorial goals driving the hardest conflicts. So Slovenia left through violence, yes, but relatively limited violence. Croatia was harder. Croatia also declared independence in 1991. But here the conflict quickly became more serious because several issues collided at once. Croatian independence, rebellion by Serb forces in parts of Croatia, and the role of the Yugoslav People's Army, the JNA, which increasingly became part of the struggle rather than a neutral federal force. This is why places like Vukovar matter so much in memory. The war in Croatia showed that the breakup was no longer only about legal acts and declarations. It was becoming a territorial war. Who controls the town? Who controls the road? Who controls the republic's future borders in practice? Macedonia, by contrast, helps us see what did not have to happen. Its exit was tense and historically important, but it did not become a full-scale war on the model of Croatia or Bosnia. That matters because it weakens the lazy claim that Yugoslavia's collapse was always destined to look the same everywhere. It did not. And then we get to Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is the hardest case, and it is the center of the whole story. Bosnia was a republic with a deeply mixed population. Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats lived across the republic in patterns that did not produce any easy ethnic map. There was no simple way to separate political communities into clean blocks of territory without coercion. That is what made Bosnia the most devastating test of whether Yugoslavia could break apart without mass violence. When Bosnia moved toward independence in 1992, many Bosnian Serbs rejected the process and feared being trapped inside a state they did not accept. Bosniak leaders and many supporters of Bosnian independence saw Bosnia as a republic, not a territory to be partitioned by nationalist projects. Bosnian Croat politics moved through its own mixture of fear, alliance, and territorial ambition. At that point, the old federal argument had fully collapsed into rival claims that could not be reconciled through a shared center. And once armed force entered the equation, Bosnia became the place where the logic of territorial sorting turned catastrophic. Siege warfare, expulsion, detention camps, ethnic cleansing, the destruction of towns and communities that did not fit nationalist maps. Ethnic cleansing was the name used for forcing populations out of territory. It was not a separate charge at the International Tribunal, but acts used to carry it out were prosecuted as crimes including persecution, deportation, forcible transfer, and murder. Sarajevo, under siege for years, became one of the defining images of the war. And in July 1995, Srebrenica became the site of genocide. This point needs to be said carefully and clearly. After forces of the Army of Republika Srpska captured the United Nations-declared safe area, more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were killed, and thousands of women, children, and elderly people were forcibly transferred. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Court of Justice established that acts committed at Srebrenica constituted genocide. That finding is specific, and criminal responsibility belongs to individuals, not to an ethnic group as a whole. Bosnia matters most because it shows why the phrase peaceful separation can be misleading. If populations are mixed, if rival leaders reject the same state, and if armed political projects treat territorial control as the answer to insecurity, then separation is no longer just a constitutional question. It becomes a struggle to change facts on the ground. And that is exactly where mass violence enters. In 1995, the Dayton Peace Agreement ended the Bosnian War. That was a real achievement. It stopped the fighting, but it did not create a neat, finished answer. It froze Bosnia and Herzegovina into a complex constitutional structure that still carries the logic of the war settlement inside it. That is one reason Bosnia still feels politically fragile today. The war ended. The argument did not disappear. And the same is true of Yugoslavia more broadly. Even after the main wars of the early 1990s, the state did not simply vanish in one clean moment. What remained was reshaped into the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, centered on Serbia and Montenegro. So even the disappearance of Yugoslavia was a process, not one date. Montenegro matters here, briefly but importantly. It shows that the story kept evolving after the worst wars. Serbia and Montenegro stayed together for a time. Then Montenegro eventually left peacefully in 2006. That is another reminder that the post-Yugoslav map did not emerge all at once, or all by the same method. And then there is Kosovo. Kosovo proves that the core argument outlived even the main dissolution wars. For many Kosovo Albanians, Serbian rule had already lost legitimacy long before the late 1990s war. For Serbia, Kosovo remained central to statehood, sovereignty, and national history. By 1998 and 1999, the conflict had escalated into war, displacement, and international intervention. NATO intervened. UN Security Council Resolution 1244 created the framework for international presence in Kosovo. And in 2008, Kosovo declared independence. But that still did not settle the issue universally. Kosovo is recognized by many states. Serbia does not recognize it. Its status remains contested internationally. So if you want proof that Yugoslavia's arguments survived the country itself, Kosovo is one of the clearest examples. And that brings us back to the original question. Why did Yugoslavia produce the most sustained wars over borders, sovereignty, and the federal state itself? Because Yugoslavia was not just falling apart ethnically, it was collapsing institutionally. Its federal system had managed disagreement without truly resolving who was sovereign. When the economy weakened, the Common Party broke, Tito was gone, and leaders turned to nationalist mobilization. That unresolved question became explosive. Then add three more things: a federal army, mixed populations, and borders that were administrative on paper, but suddenly became candidates for international frontiers. That is the combination that made Yugoslavia so dangerous. Slovenia could leave quickly. Macedonia could leave with far less violence. Montenegro could leave later and peacefully. But Bosnia could not be reduced to a clean map without force. And Kosovo showed that even after the state shrank, the struggle over legitimacy and sovereignty was still alive. So the lesson is not that different peoples cannot live together. And it is not that history made war inevitable. The lesson is that a multinational state can survive diversity for a long time if it has institutions, legitimacy, and a shared political story strong enough to manage disagreement. When those things fail, leaders may start treating territory as the solution. That is when constitutional crisis becomes border crisis, and border crisis becomes war. Yugoslavia vanished, but the arguments that destroyed it are still visible on the map. If you like my content, please like and follow for more.